Hello and welcome back. Thanks for returning from lunch. So what I propose to do first is to let each of our speakers introduce themselves with, listen carefully speakers, one sentence, because we really want to get to the content. You have one sentence, you can use semicolons and commas and parentheses, but I'm a policing, I'm a grammar police. One sentence, and we're missing Louise, and if he shows up, he'll introduce himself also. But we have Lotta, Titus, and Colin, and I'll ask each of you, please, to just take a minute here, excuse me, less than 1 minute, to give one sentence about yourself to our speakers, so they'll know who you are.
One sentence in 1 minute is very long sentence.
No, not 1 minute, one sentence, less than a minute.
Lotta Moberg, originally from Sweden, PhD from George Mason University, where we are now. Special economic zones researcher and author of The Political Economy of Special Economic Zones.
My name is Titus Gebel. I'm originally from Germany, residing in Monaco. I'm a founder and CEO of Free Private Cities Incorporated, a company that is trying to introduce private governance on special economic zones next level.
My name is Colin Grabow, and I am a trade policy analyst at the CATO Institute.
Great, thank you all. That was very concise. It's excellent. So we have 25 minutes, and there's so much I want to hear from our speakers that I'm sure to be disappointed. So I'm going to start with at least one question I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to let each of you speak about what you want to speak about. But if any one of you three, because our topic is SEZs, Puerto Crypto, and the Jones Act, we haven't heard much about the Jones Act, so I bet this is Colin, but if either of you wants to speak about this, can you just tell the audience here why the Jones Act is in here?
Sure. So the Jones Act is a law which mandates that ships carrying cargo from one U.S. port to another have to meet 4 conditions. These are: the ships have to be at least 75% U.S. owned, 75% U.S. crewed, U.S. flagged and registered, and also built in the United States. And you've probably noticed that Puerto Rico is an island. It's a small island. It's smaller than the big island of Hawaii. Its number 1 trading partner is the United States. Almost 60% of its trade is with the mainland United States. And so therefore, all those ships engaged in trade with Puerto Rico have to meet those 4 requirements. This drives up costs. A ship, a Jones Act type vessel that sails along the coastal sea lanes costs anywhere from 6 to 8 times more in the United States than an equivalent vessel built overseas. So this is a tax that is placed on Puerto Rico, drives up costs, reduces competition. It's basically a tax on Puerto Rico's consumers as well as producers, and reduces their competitiveness.
Wow, that was great and so quick. I'm going to indulge in another follow-up. It sounds like a really dumb rule, Colin. Why? Why do we have this rule in the book?
So the logic, the Jones Act is part of a law called the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. It was passed in June of 1920. This is less than 2 years after the end of World War I. During World War I, the United States relied somewhat on foreign shipping to transport U.S. troops and equipment to France during the war. After the war, Senator Wesley Jones of Washington, as well as some like-minded people, found this to be a national security threat. He wanted to bolster the U.S. maritime industry capabilities, so he thought if you put those restrictions in place, it would encourage that development. This has not been the case whatsoever. Over the last 18 years, the number of Jones Act ships has gone from 193 to 99. The number of shipyards, we have 22 mid-sized to large shipyards. Europe has 60. Japan, we have 124 total shipyards. Japan has 1,000. China has almost 2,000. The number of mariners also has gone down. Recently, there was testimony earlier this year in front of Congress. A senior union official said that licensed and unlicensed mariners are reaching critical levels. None of this is positive. It's a total failure, but it's justified on national security grounds.
Wow. Well, I'm sure you have more to say. For example, some of the public choice aspects of this. Why are we still stuck with this dumb rule? But you, the other 2 panelists, have been very patient. So now I'd like to ask for each of you to please take 5 minutes. I'll try to police you to just share with us your thoughts on this theme. We have SEZs, Puerto Rico and the Jones Act, and I'm sure you've all thought about this, so we'll start with Lotta, Titus, Colin. What do you want to say about these themes? 5 minutes.
I think you really hit on it there in terms of the political economy of this, of the aspect of these kind of policies. Because one of the approaches that I took when I was looking at the special economic zones, and I think that are particularly potent here when we're thinking about how to implement these things, is the political economy aspect of it. There will be a lot of things that you can find in terms of the literature out there on special economic zones, which will be very macro-focused. They will show exports before and after a zone and won't really tell you anything about the political development of the country or whether it actually makes sense politically. So the Jones Act will be a great example of something that is on the books not because it's a failure, it's not a failure that it's there, it's very successful. And it's successful in the sense that the people who want it there have maintained it very well. And there are people who benefit from these things. The problem with our system is that we are allowing for a very small group of people who are in particular positions to keep these kind of things on the books regardless of what the actual economic benefit of it is, and even worse, be able to craft a message that is on national security grounds in this context. We see this in the latest trade war too between the US and China. That is just a selling point, and there's no regard really for public welfare there. And I think that we can take this as a case study to really think about, okay, if we have a particular policy that we really know is really bad, and any reasonable person who understands some economics can actually understand that this is a bad thing for the country as a whole, in particular for a place for Puerto Rico, how can we circumvent this? And could the zone aspect be a way to do that? To say, we're not going to abolish anything, you're going to keep our privileges, just over here, this little island that you can forget about, we're just going to have a little exemption there. And it's not really going to affect your business model, politicians, in terms of national security or whatever message that you're crafting. So that's the kind of the way to go, and I think that it's a thankful kind of example of something that we can actually use to see how we can actually benefit an economy as a whole by getting around a really destructive policy.
So it's a dumb act, it's hard to get rid of, but you're suggesting if we only lifted it in Puerto Rico, that'd be a way to make some headway on getting rid of it.
For sure, there are two things in there. One is it really possible to do it in Puerto Rico? And I think, yes, if we could frame it in the right way, in the sense of how can we make it non-threatening to the people who want to keep it? You know, the ones that have the vested interest in keeping this thing, and that could be the little small shipping industry that we actually have. It's often actually, when you dig into these kind of things, it's actually just a bunch of politicians who like to sell this message. And if you can give them a better message to say, hey, you're going to benefit much, you're going to be really popular if you can give this message. And by the way, you don't have to disrupt the whole thing, the whole country. Just do it in this island, and everybody's going to understand that it's a special jurisdiction anyway, and nobody's been there anyway, you know, that kind of thing. So yes. And then the question has to be, is this a way to get rid of the Jones Act in the country as a whole? And, you know, that will be the best of outcomes, right? That you say, oh, okay, we did in Puerto Rico. Like, what can we learn from that? Just like we saw in the special economic zones in China. You start somewhere, and people are like, I could benefit from that. I can be actually really prosperous as a local politician. I don't have to do just the rent-seeking thing. I can actually benefit from creating some GDP and some growth here in my jurisdiction. And you could see a similar dynamic. I mean, we have a local-based politics very much in the U.S. as well, and these kind of initiatives and zones initiatives is very much about making local policymakers feel like they have a buy-in and they can benefit from them, from these kind of exemptions, and you could therefore have this spread of exemptions, if you will.
Great, thanks, Lotta. Well, Titus, you often say things that surprise me, but I'm waiting to hear what our German friend has to say about this peculiar American act. Maybe you want to talk about other things, but have at it, Titus.
No, that's fine. I think we don't have to argue about that if it makes sense or not. The question is, what can we do to help on Puerto Rico? And I think Lotta already pointed in the right direction. Probably it's not possible at the moment to get rid of the whole act. That's too big a task. But basically, it's only one line, right?
islands are, this act is not applicable to islands. It's one sentence that you change the law and then you are out. If even this is too hard, next best would be to go to Puerto Rican card. Say they are broke partly because of this problem, and so we are helping Puerto Rico and making a special explicit exemption for Puerto Rico in the Jones Act. The third best options would be to say, okay, we are creating a new special economic zone in Puerto Rico, but maybe also somewhere else, to foster development, and this special economic zone is exempted from the Jones Act. So that is, I would say, this is normally, let's try, if best is all islands, and then second best, and so on and so forth. So the two other issues, special economic zones and Puerto Crypto, I would try to link those. The one of you that have followed my speech yesterday know that I'm favoring free private cities as an option. I think private governance works better for a variety of reasons than public governance. But even with free private city models, it's possible to say, okay, there we make a mixed model, that there's a public commission overseeing that. You can also offer the residents of a free private city that they own the city. Right? It wouldn't change the model because everybody still had the contract that would protect his personal situation. But the ownership would be then maybe you can say more aligned with the interests of the people, of the resident. But that's not a big issue who owns the city. And if it's a special economic zone run by a council or a free private city run by a private company, that is only just one step further. If we can agree that there's a special zone created in Puerto Rico that allows for special regulation and own administration, you have all heard about this corruption stuff, etc. It is very important that we put up our own administration. And then that would include crypto regulation. Right? We would say, okay, we make this a space that is extremely attractive to blockchain and crypto companies, with a special regulation designed for those types of businesses. And then you could put everything together, right? You have a special economic zone, which is exempted from the Jones Act, which has a special crypto regulation, and which has a certain legal autonomy and own administration to solve all these corruption and bureaucracy issues.
You see what I mean? I mean, he's not even from America. He's got a 3-step program for amending the Jones Act. I can't wait to read your book. It's not in English yet. I'm sure it's going to be
coming next month in English.
Not soon enough. Colin, you've been looking at the Jones Act for a long time. You're, I guess, CATO's lead person on this. So, yeah, lay it on us. What's the problem? What's the fix?
So, as far as the problem, now I talked about the Jones Act more generally for the United States. For Puerto Rico specifically, we don't know exactly how much the Jones Act costs Puerto Rico. Some people say, well, a gallon of milk costs X in San Juan. You look at the cost of Miami, there's your difference. That's the Jones Act. It's not entirely true because there are lots of factors that go into determining prices. But back in 2011, I believe, 2012, a couple Puerto Rican PhD economists released a study. They tried to quantify the costs. They came up with a figure of $537 million. Now, this is rooted in theory, modeling, stuff like that, but there are a few things that we do know 100% about Puerto Rico and the Jones Act. We know there have been at least 6 executives from various shipping companies who are in federal prison right now because of price fixing and violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Price fixing is a lot easier to do when you cut down on competition, as the Jones Act does. We know that in 2012, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York released a study about Puerto Rico, which found that the Jones Act hurts productivity on the island. It found that to ship a 20-foot container full of household and commercial items from the East Coast to Puerto Rico costs over $3,000. The same container going to Santo Domingo would cost $1,500. To send it to Kingston, Jamaica, $1,700. This is almost double the cost. We know that in 2013, the GAO released a study about the Jones Act in Puerto Rico. They talked to someone that imports jet fuel. They said, yeah, we source from Venezuela because it's cheaper than buying it from the United States. We found that they talked to the Puerto Rican Power Authority. They said, we'd like to change our power generation from oil to natural gas. The U.S. has an energy revolution going on. We'd like to buy from the U.S. Number one, at the time, there were no ships capable of carrying natural gas even going to Puerto Rico. Number two, once they factor in the transportation costs, they figure there are no cost savings. They talk to the Puerto Rican Farm Bureau. It makes Puerto Ricans import from foreigners for feed and fertilizer rather than the United States. In fact, it's cheaper to source from St. John, Canada than New Jersey, even though St. John, Canada is 500 miles further away. We know that in Puerto Rico is not just one island, it's several islands. There's also Vieques, Culebra. If you want to transport goods between those islands, they have to be Jones Act compliant. That means you're paying more for those ferries and the ships that you're using. This is another tax on Puerto Rico. So what can be done? As my panelists point out, giving Puerto Rico an exemption of the Jones Act would be a great start. In fact, there's been legislation introduced by Senator Mike Lee, Utah, and Senator John McCain of Arizona. Notice that they're both from landlocked states, and they're actually pushing on this. The congressional delegations of Hawaii and Alaska, which are hurt by the Jones Act, are 100%, all of them, favor of the Jones Act because of special interest and be concentrated in places that have a lot of maritime industry. That would be a great start. It could be a great experiment. The Jones Act supporters always doom monger and say this is going to hurt our national security, it's going to be terrible for the island. Let's find out. It's Puerto Rico, it's one island. Let's do an experiment. Short of that, I think another possibly politically feasible policy option is to remove the domestic build requirement. This is a really weird requirement. Internationally, lots of countries have restrictions on domestic shipping, but the domestic build is very unusual. Also, just look within the context of the United States. If you want to run a trucking company, you don't have to buy a US-built truck. If you want to fly an airline, you don't have to buy from Boeing exclusively, and yet we do this for the shipping industry. So I think that just taking the same policies we apply to other transportation sectors and applying it to US shipping would go a long way in reducing the cost of ships, less cost, more ships, more competition, lower prices.
Go ahead.
What then are the powerful interest groups here? Would you say that the shipping industry is keeping the country hostage by keeping this act in place?
So that's a great question. There's a number of interests at play here. So the shipbuilding companies, obviously they love this law because it says you have to buy from them. Reduces competition, they love it. You have the unions that work in these yards, they're for it. Even the shipping companies themselves, these carriers, weirdly, they back it because on the one hand, they have to pay more for ships. On the other hand, it's a whole lot less competition. I mean, think about it. Without the Jones Act, a ship coming over from Rotterdam to New Jersey, for example, could then continue on down to, say, Brazil, passes by Miami, Savannah, numerous, Puerto Rico on the way on to Brazil. They could stop at all these places and offer service. They can't do that now. That is against the law. A ship going from Los Angeles to Japan cannot stop in Hawaii along the way unless it's Jones Act compliance.
Isn't there a similar rule with regard to aircraft, foreign aircraft in the United
So
States?
foreign aircraft, you'll notice that you have never been able to fly Emirates from Miami to Chicago. There's a reason for that. It's because foreign airlines cannot offer domestic service within the United States, which is why there are so many partnerships. So we do have similar laws in place for the airline sector. However, we don't have that domestic build requirement for the airline sector. So you can buy an Airbus, for example.
Wow, I've learned a lot from this. I want to give our panelists a chance, as Lotta did, to ask each other questions or comment on this, and then I'll open it up to you. Anything you want to say to each other or ask each other about this?
Yeah, Colin, I have just one question. You mentioned this bill that is coming. Is it just a special Puerto Rico bill to exempt just Puerto Rico?
Yes, it's Puerto Rico specific.
All right, great. Let's hear from some of the audience. I think this gentleman had his hand up first, please.
Thank you. So I have a question about optics or marketing for these ideas. Everyone in Puerto Rico agrees that the Jones Act should be gone. This has been something I've known. Everybody has known their entire life, and we're the one shining silver lining from the hurricane is that people are talking about it. So thank you for making noise about it. But I still have a lot of concerns and issues with special economic zones and cryptocurrency, specifically with how Puerto Ricans are going to perceive it. This is not my opinion, just like the fact of what's going on in the island right now, just because of political momentum and stuff. I know that, or I worry that the movement of a bunch of people from other countries and specifically the United States for cryptocurrency purposes has a very familiar taste to many Puerto Ricans of something of gentrification or colonialism, of people trying to come and be a white savior. And And then regarding special economic zones, the left is just, if you have many special economic zones, then great, fosters competition. If you have one, it just looks like a special zone of corporate welfare. And I know that politicians would never allow it in Puerto Rico simply because of the fact of how it looks optically in marketing. So what are other buzzwords you can use, or how do you ensure not only that doing these things actually benefit Puerto Rico, but also that we can market it so that it doesn't feel like gentrification or neocolonialism or corporate welfare or any of these things?
Please. Yeah, this is a very good question and a very justified remark, right? Because there, you put a bunch of things together. I think one is any special economic zone that is coming from basically from a foreign company that is operated within the country, or people who are very active there, is in some regions received as a kind of colonialism, or foreign countries are saying us what we should have to do. So you can easily counteract it, or not easily, but you can counteract that by just involving Puerto Ricans in that company, right? And I was in the mining sector always really happy when I was in countries where the people told me, well, for example, Mongolia, they set up a new coal mine. And I said, who is doing that? These are 4 Mongolian guys who worked for McKinsey, but they're domestic. And I'm always happy when I hear that, because it shows that these people are not only willing, but also capable of doing that. And what I have heard in the last 2 days, I have absolutely no doubt that we will find qualified people from Puerto Rico. So a joint venture should be doable with, say, a company from the US or wherever from Europe with a Puerto Rican, make a joint venture, and you put people like you in front and say, okay, this is the speaker of our company, and he's from Puerto Rico, and he has something to say. And you can also put up people on the streets and say, down with the Jones Act, right? And then all the leftist journalists can come and are forced basically to report about that. But if it's true what you're saying, that the majority of the people in Puerto Rico is against the Jones Act, then you should make it loud and clear, because otherwise, you heard, you have not really much representation in the U.S. Senate. So you have to really go to the press, right? And support those initiatives. And the other thing is, it's more or less about really how you look at the outside, the marketing, but there we would really need support from you, right? Not just come from the outside and say we know better, but it has to come from inside.
And I would add too, in terms of the zone model, I would say that the private developed zone hit at some of the things that you would be, your question, so to speak, would be worrying about, in the sense of the model that you have in Dominican Republic, I think would be very well applicable. It can be improved, but it can be very applicable to Puerto Rico, in the sense of the developer, the zones are, all the private zone developers that I met were Dominicans. They know how to get their land, and they set up some facilities and services there. You don't need to say, well, we're going to make sure that 50% of the investors are going to be domestic. Yes, you can have some of that, but I think that's more putting more restrictions on yourself. Ownership can easily be in the hand of the domestic people, as long as it's a privately developed zone. So I think that often actually it's contradictory, because people think about government developing in the hands of the people. Well, in fact, it's the government then becomes in the hands of the foreign investors, and that's when you can get your colonialism. You said also that we want many zones spread out so that you don't get the corporate welfare. Well, I would actually say the opposite. It's often the case that when you have them spread out, that's when you have these kind of single factory zones that looks exactly like corporate welfare to me, and it's more competitive when you can actually have a zone with both more economies of scale and more opportunity to kind of locate in a good place where you can have it run by a group of locals. And it's much less of corporate welfare when it's actually more of a real, like, good-sized zone, rather than companies here and there who can locate anywhere and apply for these kind of privileges.
Anything you want to add, Colin?
I'll just say that you are absolutely correct that Puerto Ricans are well aware of the Jones Act. Last November, there was something called the Unity March for Puerto Rico here in Washington, D.C. It warmed my heart to see someone carrying a sign with a drawing of a noose on it, and it said, Jones Act, strangling the economy, repeal. Someone else had a sign that said, eliminate the Jones Act. That really warmed my heart. Those people were my heroes. So thank you, Puerto Rico.
Okay, I just want to add one little thing to that. I've actually advocated lifting the Jones Act in Puerto Rico only within foreign trade zones. This goes even narrower. That would give us 3 places in Puerto Rico, answering your question. And these foreign trade zones are behind secure barriers because they're outside of the customs and duties territory of the United States. And this would assuage concerns which I guess are not popular now, but originally, as I understand it, the Jones Act was also concerned about these foreign mariners sitting in our ports, and who knows, they could engage in sabotage. Maybe that's silly, but they would be behind chain link fences in Puerto Rico in these 3 places. There's another idea. Okay, here and then over here. Jen, yes.
First of all, I need to get Colin to answer a question on the build concept. Is it implied that there is no possibility of accessing secondary purchase of ships? In other words, used ships bought by Americans, manned by Americans, in other words, don't require the build domestically?
Oh, no. No, it's not legal. I believe there is one exception. For example, a ship is seized in a drug raid, and that ship was built overseas and then is sold at auction. I think there might be some exemption for that. But otherwise, yeah, even secondhand ships, no, they will not qualify under the Jones Act. It has to be built here in the United States.
So then I'll make my point.
Yeah.
I think there may be an option to use technology to manipulate specific legal paradigms. And in this case, I'm focused on autonomous shipping. So the idea of being manned and even being built, if you look at additive manufacture, robotics, and the assembly of a ship wherever you may want, it could be as convenient to set up a shipbuilding facility in Puerto Rico on demand to create these new kinds of ships, which are unmanned. And then by doing so, you have a fleet, which is really at the disposal of Puerto Rico and is in compliance. So I've been also talking to Tom about the idea that may allow you also to do the flag of convenience, right? So I'm wondering what your thoughts would be on applying what we all see coming with autonomous transportation and port automation, that would provide in the context of a free trade zone the opportunity to marry shipping and intermodal transport that would also be in compliance with the act.
It's hard for me to speak to that, but I will say this. I think you make a great point about the advent of autonomous shipping. That's one reason why I say, look, let's focus on the domestic build requirement, because the crew, that's going to take care of itself. I mean, already, if you look at the number of crew required on ships, it's fallen dramatically in recent decades. So, ultimately, I mean, I can see they're, totally autonomous, or you have maybe 3 people on board or something like this. So crew costs will steadily come down just through technology, as you said. As for the rest of it, I'm not sure I can comment intelligently enough on that, really answer your question.
Specifically, I'm talking to Rolls-Royce Marines.
Okay.
They want to do a whole family of autonomous ships, from little water shuttles to whatever. And I want to be able to say, hey, here's Puerto Rico. I've had that conversation. And they're telling me, it's like, we can't even play in the game unless we get dispensation somehow. And does that mean that they have to set up a shop in Puerto Rico or do it?
So here's the funny thing. We require that ships be domestically built, but what does domestically built really mean? For example, the shipyard in Philadelphia is Norwegian owned by Aker, okay? The ships, they're designed in South Korea, okay? The engines are foreign as well. So, for example, I recently wrote about this vessel, this shipping vessel up in the Pacific Northwest. It was built in Anacortes, Washington, and yet it cannot fish in U.S. waters. Why? Because it violates the Jones Act. Even though it was built here, they took a small bit of steel that was bent and cut in the Netherlands and imported it and used it in the ship. Well, that violates the Jones Act. You can use raw foreign steel in the Jones Act and be compliant, but if you just drill a hole in that piece of steel overseas, it's in violation. There's a maximum of 1.5% of foreign weight that can be used in the ship. Also, the ship itself, you can use a foreign engine, but the problem comes in when you're talking about the hull and the superstructure. That can't be foreign. So it's a myth that we build 100% American ships now anyway. This is ridiculous. They're totally part of the international supply chain. But we get all the downside of having high U.S. labor costs. We don't specialize. Lots of countries have specialties. The Japanese and the Koreans, Chinese, they build cargo ships. You go to Norway, they build ships specific to the oil industry. Finland, I think, does cruise ships. Everyone has a specialty. In the U.S., we're a jack of trade, master of none, with the possible exception of river barges.
So I just wanted to add.
Sorry, I'm afraid you've gotten the cutoff. You had two shots.
It's an excellent conversation, but at that point, it's best to have it one-on-one.
All right. I think it's wonderful that we've been able to geek out on the Jones Act. I mean, we're not even shipping specialists. So yay for us, and I can't even get to all the questions. So thank you all, and let's join in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.